PBRO, the Presbyterian Border Region Outreach, works with 5 ministries along the U.S.-Mexican border, one of which is Proyecto Amistad, the Friendship Project. Based in Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, across the border from Laredo, Texas, Proyecto Amistad was very active for years and is now revitalizing itself in the time of COVID, making friends and meeting needs on the border.
Proyecto Amistad is a ministry who are working with churches in the United States and Mexico in a partnership.
The border crossing between these two towns is one of the most active in the country and reportedly very high in illegal drug traffic. But both towns are also filled with the usual busy activity of thriving border towns. Heading up Proyecto Amistad is Roberto Medina, who has a straightforward way of seeing things.
We don't looking for a new ministry. We just respond to a need of our friends or the people who suffer the needs. It's not something, okay, we need to create this. No, it's a response. It's a kind of need we feel because we suffer the same situation as a family.
Roberto and his wife Kasume have spent their lives responding to the needs of others. They lost a child at a young age, and this grew into their children's club, a place where local children could do activities, like this artwork made from tissue paper and tempera paint.
This craft was the same craft the children make it in Club Amistad. Since the COVID, I don't have the opportunity to visit the children's club. It was my passion before the COVID.
The children's education program is now on hold, and the little thriving church here will also need to wait for the pandemic to subside to gather again.
We are teachers, we are preachers, and we are friends of our children. So now we can't see them, and that's painful.
But the pain of COVID has also created needs to be met. As so often happens in ministry, personal experience leads to knowledge of a current opportunity to serve. Roberto's brother became sick, and on a visit to the local hospital, he saw the families of COVID patients.
I see the need of the people outside, so I'm starting to provide just, water bottles and some face masks.
COVID has impacted us, and the Friendship Project responds. We have collected medical supplies.
So what we decide with all of this is we donate to the hospital, to the Red Cross, to nurses, to the ambulances. We have a lot.
And they need it.
Yeah, they need a lot.
Roberto explains to fellow board mission director Callie Fernandez a way of keeping families connected and safe.
Bata quirúrgica.
A hospital gown.
They provide PPE to the families of COVID patients. They've also found access to full gowns so that the families can visit their loved ones sick with COVID.
And so they are allowed to visit their family members in the hospital.
Exactly. They can get inside and they can pray for them.
The medical community here doesn't have the resources to provide doctors and nurses with proper masks. When Roberto discovered that an N95 mask cost over $20 a piece in Mexico, he found the very same masks on the internet for $5. And now they assemble and provide these kits to give to healthcare professionals.
We tell them it's a brothers and sisters from the U.S. churches who provide resources so I can buy these and bring it to you. So they are so grateful with this.
But it is meeting the spiritual needs of those suffering fear and anxiety that stands as most rewarding. Roberto prayed with a man heartbroken about his mother, who was on the phone in the hospital with COVID. The man could not go see her, but Proyecto Amistad was there, representing friendship, standing in the gap.
It's like, the book of Matthew calls us about who is your neighbor. So we respond to my neighbors. The people who live in my town, who suffer the same I suffer. It's a need you feel. It's something you don't looking for. It's something just, you need to do that. It's something I can explain.
Making friendships, looking for neighbors. Proyecto Amistad, the Friendship Project.
Good afternoon, and so I have the privilege of presenting our next presenter. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Kelly. We can hear you.
Okay. Reverend Dr. Gregory Cuéllar is the Associate Professor of Old Testament at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. And as a biblical scholar, Dr. Cuéllar is interested in alternative ways of reading the biblical text, in particular, those that are rooted in a larger contrapuntal discourse of liberation. He has written on topics related to the US-Mexico borderlands, Latinx immigration, race, empire, and museums. A major focal point in his research lies at the intersections of archives, migratory aesthetics, borderland, and post-colonial justice. He is currently researching the social, political, and ethical contours of religious services provided within the state-contracted family detention facilities. He's the author of Resacralizing the Other at the US-Mexican Border, a Borderland Hermeneutics, Empire, the British Museum, and Making of the Biblical Scholar in the 19th Century, Archival Criticism, and Voices of Marginality, Exile and Return in 2nd Isaiah 40 through 55, and The Mexican Immigrant Experience. In terms of advocacy work, he's the co-founder of the refugee artwork project called Arte de Lágrimas, Art of Tears, Refugee Artwork Project. Welcome, Dr. Cuéllar, and thank you for joining us.
It is a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much, Kali Fernandez, for your introduction. And I also would like to thank Reverend Elizabeth Smith and all of the leaders that have been organizing and preparing for this event. Thank you for the invitation to be with you. I understand that there will be a PowerPoint presentation shared with you here as part of my talk, Caring for the Sacred Other.
And you should have control of the screen.
Thank you. Let's see here. So I want to make sure that I'm able to advance the slides. From what I understand is I'm using my own forward keys.
That's right. Oh, there you go.
There you go.
We were having
Okay,
a little
great.
bit of a challenge before, but it looks like it's working now.
Perfect. Thank you. In this season of the US-Mexico borderlands, those bearing the brunt of elite powers' othering assaults are migrant border crossers. Marking the current contours of state care for migrant border crossers is a dehumanizing care system in which diagnosis and treatment of trauma occurs within a framework of racializing criminality. So I'm just going to move now to the next slide here. Such a scheme triggers a trajectory of care practices that begin with their arrest and then imprisonment, defined as criminal aliens. Quote, migrant border crossers are denied their human fullness, and as such, their personhoods remain racialized, criminalized, and commoditized throughout the state's caring operations. It is worth repeating that state discourse sets the value threshold of migrant border crossers well below their human fullness. and othering migrant border crossers, the state relies on a repertoire of desacralizing categories: illegal, alien, and criminal, to name a few. These labels translate into an inhumane care system, beginning at the US-Mexico border, where wounded and depleted migrant bodies are arrested, detained, and eventually deported. Now, I want to present to you this slide here, and see if I could bring it up as a full screen. So here we go. There we go. There we are. So you could see with the current statistics of removals, and this is a chart that's taken from Homeland Security. You can see the top 10 nationalities that are at the forefront of ICE's removals are Black and brown bodied people. And this is a trend that has been persistent within the past administration. These labels, illegal, alien, and criminal, translate into an inhumane care system, beginning at the US-Mexico border, where wounded and depleted migrant bodies are arrested, detained, and deported. This approach to pain and trauma taints the borderlands as the decisive site of human desacralization. Moreover, such an approach is not isolated to migrants, but rather extends to border communities due to their common ethnicity, with many brown and Black-bodied border crossers. Ultimately, the dehumanizing care of racially criminalized border crossers serves as a template for all Black and brown-bodied people in the US-Mexico borderlands. These insidious ripple effects are what link migrant border crossers to the border community under a hegemonic regime that seeks to subjugate and devour all life deemed non-sacred by the state. And as you could see, the numbers for the ICE removals, this is part of a broader system, the immigration detention complex, industrial complex, which I want to give you a sort of a preview of. This quote here, I think, is very fitting. Golash Boza and Handageu Sotelo labeled the US deportation machine a, quote, gendered racial removal program, pointing out that post 9/11 deportations have overwhelmingly focused on Black and Latino men. And you could see this in the statistics that are put out each fiscal year by the Homeland Security and ICE. So this is not private information. This is information you can access freely at the Homeland Security webpage. We know that this immigration detention complex is run mainly by private prison companies. So with the this racialization and criminalization of migrant border crossers, there is money to be made. And so this is what we're talking about, the primary mode of care that comes out of this racially criminalization of border crossers that pervades the current administration. You have groups like GEO, CoreCivic, MTC, Alaska Native corporations. These are some of the major players who are expanding the immigration detention complex. We have over 200 immigration detention centers in various places throughout the US. Most of these facilities are owned by private prison companies. And so we are the country with the most immigration detention centers in the world. This is what we put forward as the primary mode for caring for border crossers. Detainment, this incarceration. So this is an important thing to keep in mind, is what is the current mode of care? Where are the investments of taxpayers' money? What is the state doing to care for migrant border crossers? And what you see clearly is a dehumanizing care system. We know that the primary populations who are the objects of this inhumane care system are Black and brown-bodied people. They are coming in mass due to a variety of issues. One of the primary having to do with economic scarcity. You also have climate change. There are populations who are moving just to survive, just for the sake of living another day. And of course, those nation states that are accumulating enormous amounts of wealth are the destination places for many of these migrating populations. But you can see a racial division. When you follow the economy, it also divides into racial disparities. So I'm gonna see if this this video will show here. There is an embedded video on the on that slide there. Perhaps I could go to my PowerPoint, and is it possible to share it from?
Yes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop our current share and I'm going to allow you to share from your own computer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you should be able to share.
Thank you.
Watchtowers up here, the watchtowers up close to I don't even want to get ready.
So we want to look into a bit of the current care system that is provided for mainly brown and black-bodied border crossers. As you can see, none of it reveals a form of care that perhaps you would be running to if you were in need of physical or emotional care. We're talking about modes of treating people that are far beyond what would we consider uh, human value, ascribing human value to these populations. And so this is one of the largest detention centers in the West Coast. It's located in California. It had a number of issues related to the COVID-19 outbreak that was happening in this facility. It's one of the largest facilities in the West Coast. And as is typical of immigration detention centers, they are located far removed from public view. They usually are in rural towns, economically depressed towns, out in places that are so far removed from mainstream vision that we lose sight of these facilities. But this approach to treating and caring for migrant border crossers is a multi-million-dollar industry that draws heavily on taxpayers' money. And as you could see, this is just one example of over 100 plus detention centers spread out throughout the US, where you find a majority of those who are being detained, transferred, or deported from these facilities are brown and black-bodied people, right? So Mexico, the Northern Triangle of Central America, those parts of the world usually are the primary targets for this inhumane approach to caring for their needs. So that a lot of the money that is being generated is generated on these bodies who are coming out of Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. Now, the question is, can a borderland hermeneutic of care and healing be offered? Is there an alternative approach that we can offer as a way to counter this pervasive strategy that is implemented by the state using taxpayers' money to treat human beings as if they are refuse, as if they are nothing? And ultimately, the goal in what you find in the state apparatus in terms of caring for migrant border crossers ultimately shows that they have their death, their annihilation as the ultimate goal. Think about that. When you're talking about caring for people, you would not want to enter into a doctor's office knowing that the doctor has in mind your death as the result of his or her treatment of your illness. But that is ultimately what we have going on as part of the norm for treating migrant border crossers. What we have in mind is the increase, the maximum increase of profit gain for the private prison company and the decrease of these populations by annihilating them. This is what I would argue, it's sort of bordering on what we would call our modern day Holocaust. And there are multiple reports you could find in the press where deportees, when they return back to their homelands, do suffer death. And I don't need to repeat those. So the question is, can a borderland hermeneutic of care and healing be offered instead? What if we had as the goal for migrant border crossers their survival, their thriving, their life, their livelihood? What would the institutions look like then? What would our systems of care look like if we were seeking to secure the livelihood of those who are the most vulnerable, starting first with children, infants? And here I'm thinking of the policy to separate infants from their parents. The parent-child relationship should be one of the first points of care that we offer migrant border crossers. But unfortunately, under this administration, it was the first point that they used as a form of torture. We have to change that. And I think that we have to ask this question: can a borderland hermeneutic of care and healing be offered instead? This is where, in my own work, I'm trying to rely on other forms of care that have been present in Borderlands culture since the formation of the border, since the 19th century. Here I'm thinking of curanderismo. This is what we would call Medicaid for the marginalized, right? Those who were did not have access to medical care, and so relied on the local wisdom and sages as a way to approach or address their ailments and needs for care. So I'm going to pivot. If we see in the institutionalized forms of care, and I'm thinking of the care that's happening in immigration detention centers, where they claim to have adequate facilities and equipment and personnel for meeting the needs of their detainees, which we see is sorely lacking because of the amount of deaths that have increased due to COVID-19 and the spread of it in immigration detention centers across the US. It's not working. And so what other form of care and healing can we offer migrant border crossers? And so this is why I think curanderismo has something to offer us. And so I want to give you this video, set it up here. This is a video from the Border Studies collection out of UT Rio Grande Valley. And they have a number of crucial videos of curanderos engaged in the practice of curanderismo. So I just want you to imagine what kind of care could come out of a curanderismo approach. What if we offered that to migrant border crossers rather than detention?
Joe prefers to work in his own office because he feels his strength is greatest there. But when necessary, he visits his patients in their homes. The man is 72 years old, had recently undergone surgery to remove gallstones. That surgery was successful, but the man went into severe post-operative depression. After trying many different approaches, his wife asked Poncho to come to their home in the U.S. to help him. Poncho asked that the family have certain items ready for the cure. They are to supply 5 eggs, 4 lemons, and a handful of sweet basil. vessel. These are the tools, along with the agua preparada and oil, which he himself brought, that he feels are necessary to complete this cure. In some cures, live animals, such as black chickens or doves, are used as a sacrifice during the cure. Here, the eggs, since they are living cells, represent those animals. The eggs and the lemons, when used with the spells and incantations of the occult sciences, are thought to possess magical forces that can be used either to help or harm the patient. Culture maintains good social relationships with his patients at all times. In the initial stage of most cures, it simply sits, talks, listens, and places the patient at ease. Only after asking about and discussing the patient's state of health and state of mind does he begin a cure. Before beginning the cure, Ponce removes all metal objects that are in contact with his body. He states that this is necessary because the cures utilize mental vibration, vibraciones mentales, and spiritual currents, corrientes espirituales, directed from the curandero to his patient. The metal objects interfere with the proper channeling of these forces, and they can produce small electrical discharges which interrupt the cure. The cure is initiated by cleansing the eggs and lemons with alcohol. It is desirable that everything used in the cure be perfectly clean. The patient is served alternately with an egg and a lemon. According to Poncho, the invocations and exorcisms of the curanderos give the eggs the power to absorb the problems affecting the patient. He also states that the lemons give strength to the patient's mental vibrations. This aids the curandero to dominate the patient's problem. Curanderos often pray out loud over their patients, but Poncho makes his prayers and incantations silently. He feels they are part of his strength, and for others to know these prayers and incantations would place him in danger of attack from a jealous rival. final sweeping of the cure is done with sweet basil albahaca, which has been sprinkled with agua preparada to purify it and enhance its ability to induce a tranquil state of mind in the patient. The cure is finalized with oil, a frequent healing tool of the church. This special oil is rubbed on the patient's head and joints to cut away the negative vibrations and currents that encompass him. The shape of the cross is used to protect the healer from the forces as they are being removed. When the cure is finished, the patient's head is rubbed with agua preparada to give him mental strength. His excitement level is checked to determine whether he should stay lying down for several hours after the cure or make it up immediately.
In stark contrast to the state's human care regime in the US-Mexico borderlands, curanderismo resorts to healing care practices that defy the racializing logic subtending Western scientific objectivity by first privileging minoritized bodies as worthy of healing touch. You could see that in the curanderos' approach to the body is the power of touch, where in Western scientific approaches and that which is sponsored by the state is to first criminalize the body and then detain it apart from the social connections, the networks those sources of healing that would contribute to the well-being of the minoritized body. For the curandero, it's to go into the home, the place where they are settled, and using elements that are familiar, knowing the context of the patient. So there's this transcendent meaning, symbolic interchange, historical connectedness, and sacralized spaces. In this way, the standards for care do not default to a white, male, heterosexual, abled body. Rather, minoritized bodies are understood to be intrinsically sacred from the outset. There's no criminalization happening. There's no racialization happening in the encounter between the curandero and the patient. There's an immediate acceptance and embracing of that person's body. As a result, curanderismo, or what Luis de Leon calls curandera praxis, does not operate within a matrix in which pained, minoritized bodies are measured, weighed, and calibrated according to a Western social ideal. And in doing so, they fall short, right? So it's a Western scientific approach to care, but under a racial logic. And so what that does, it immediately devalues the person in all of the various scientific measurements and care that is being administered. So it sort of negates Western science when it operates using a racialized logic. In many ways, this attempt to standardize minoritized bodies is for curandera praxis a contributing factor to their pain and trauma. Right? It's seeing them as criminal, seeing them as inferior, seeing them as void of value. For this reason, Borderlands curandera praxis does not view pain minoritized bodies as a deviation from the Western social ideal, but rather as a person with agency, discernment, transcendence, symbolic awareness, as well as someone with a social critique. They are not just void of intelligence. They're not just inanimate objects used for the expansion of state ideology. In turning to curandera praxis as a theoretical source for a borderland hermeneutic, the focus lies less on ingredients, rituals, and folklore than on the rhetorical meaning of curandera institutions, instincts, and conceptualizations of the pained human other as expressed through sacralizing performances and the production of sacred spaces. As you saw in the video, the house, the room, the place where the patient lays his head, that becomes a sacred space. And that's done through the sacralizing performances, that you're approaching someone with value, someone who has worth. And so the movements and the touches embody that worth and that value system. Borderlands curandera praxis functions innately as a counter epistemology, in that it sacralizes brown and black-bodied people away from state-sponsored human care systems. Defined as a backward logic, right? So this would be what the state would offer, in describing curandero praxis. Curandero praxis privileges marginality, both in terms of diagnosing pain and healing strategies. Unlike the dominant institutions of human care, which are mostly under the watchful gaze of the state, curandera praxis admits to a mode of care that harnesses marginality. In other words, that your marginalized condition and status is of enormous value. And that alone displaces elite power and their devaluing praxis. Instead of state-sponsored institutions controlling the domain of care, curandera praxis commands the healing moment by sacralizing marginality, from the physical to the metaphysical. This renders human otherness as the sacred portal through which healing care is made possible. To resemble the logics inherent within state-sponsored human care systems is not the aim of curandera praxis, for to do so only nullify the healing process. Otherness, both in terms of a minoritized body and a counter logic of care, frames the sacralizing process of curandera praxis. Through a carefully constructed web of inversions, listen to this, otherness is made sacred. Hence, unleashing a healing reversal process for the elite forces that weaponize otherness to desacralize and hence dehumanize minoritized bodies. Well, I've come to the end of my talk. I want to have some time, open up some time certainly for fielding questions and engaging in a discussion. I have much more that I had intended to read, but I do want to be respectful of the time and also offer opportunity for the audience to engage in discussion.
If you could stop screen share, that would be great.
I do have one question for you, Dr. Cuéllar. Can you talk more about the mode in which curandera practice values and sacralizes marginality? What does that look like?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So again, using the video as an example, most of the populations who turn to curanderismo often fall outside of mainstream access to care, so that they either through their own racialization, economic status, what we would consider traditional forms of care or public forms of care fall out of reach. And so they occupy spaces that are economically, socially, ethnically marginal. And so what the curandero does is they go to the marginal space, right? It's as you could see, this was a house visit by the curandero, going to the margins, what is often called in Spanish, el barrio. Right? This is el barrio, where you know that the wealth of or the distribution of wealth somehow falls short in these areas, and that has enormous implications on access to healthy food, to healthcare in general. So the curandero goes to those places. And rather than using sort of the fabric pharmaceutical approach, or these fabricated healing approach, they're figuring out the context. So it's harnessing that marginality, and then realizing that there is a metaphysical world that's contributes to the healing process, and it's in a very important way. It's they are privileging the metaphysical, the spiritual, on top of medicinal elements, things that are accessible, things that that the patient would have access to: eggs, lemon, herbs. These are elements that they don't have to go to the pharmacy to buy. They have them growing in their midst. So this is accessible. What has been considered marginal, that's what the curandero harnesses, channels those elements, and uses them to offer care to the patient.
I have another question also. We just received another question from Joe and Selena. How would you envision this being brought into the context of detention centers?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So you would inevitably be franchising in a capitalist way curanderismo if you bring it into the detention center. I think that what it does, the detention center as an environment for healing and channeling energy that is that contributes to the well-being of detainees is impossible, because the very nature of the detention has a penal logic, right? It's to ensure that you are criminal, so that from the outset it disrupts any sort of curandera praxis. Detainees would need to be released from the detention centers and put in the places where they are rooted, where they have a cultural connection, where they have family members, right? This is part of what the curandero does, is it makes sure that the entire family unit is involved in the healing process. They are asked questions, they are interviewed by the curandera, and there are elements that are present that trigger memory connection to those who have not just the family who are living, but extended family and family that sort of the ancestral families. So the detention center would be as a physical space adverse to all of those various elements that are needed in order to sacralize the space and ensure maximum healing. So I wouldn't, I don't see there being a relationship that is effective.
I have a comment also from Dory, and she has the first question. She said that helps me. Thank you. I'm a white gringa lady in the center of the institutional form of care. So I find myself both skeptical and desiring access to these curanderismo margins, and at the same time, trying to accept that it is not my space. So does it become my work to center and advocate for the practice? Use my privilege to protect the space?
Yeah, and what I'm sort of trying to present is not necessarily the sort of the specific curanderos or curanderas and how they operate in their particular context. There are multiple. This is just one view of a very complex system that is fluid and is still growing and evolving. But what we can do is draw nuggets of wisdom from the overall elements that are valued within curandera praxis. And one of the things that I think is translatable, regardless of who are your social location is the minoritized social location or you find yourself in a privileged social location, we can see how curandera praxis values marginality. It takes seriously the specific context of the person, knowing their familial relationships, knowing their economic status. A lot of the curanderos and curanderas that I studied, what I've discovered is that they do what they do because it's a calling. And so there is very little money exchanged in the process. When you think of that in terms of medical care and mainstream society, what drives care is profit margins and increasing the amount of money one gains in treating patients. Could you imagine a healthcare system that treats human beings because they're human beings, not because they are potential clients of a money making industry, so that's one thing that you find, these nuggets of wisdom and a value system that if you were to bring into the current state systems of healthcare, it would, in my sense, move into a broader and more organic way of care that could allow, in my ministry, it's migrant border crossers, allow them a place where they can thrive. So you don't think of yourself as completely out just because you're privileged. There's certain elements you could certainly incorporate into the places of privilege you're in.
I have a comment from the Shalom Mennonite Fellowship, and they suggest that visitors into detention center provide an embodied curandero connection because those held in these prisons have their own capacity and resiliency to human friendship and connections and creativities. Even though, yes, so much of healing is horribly limited in the space of immigration, prison, healing relationships are still viable. And then I have another question, Dr. Cuéllar. How would you envision applying this approach in the context of migration and supporting people on their journey for asylum? Or would this mainly apply to caring for people that fall ill?
Yeah, and I think that's what curandera praxis is offers a very broad spectrum of care. There's the spiritual element, there's the emotional, the psychological element, and then there's the physical element, so that you have a very broad repertoire to draw from in addressing multiple issues of the human being. And I think there's certainly a lot to be learned from the medicinal worth of plants and particular organic elements. I think we could still, essential oils, there's certainly things that could be still tapped into for treating the physical body and lowering health costs, right? So, which is what the curanderos do, right? It's lowering health costs. And when you lower health costs, you lower stress. And the stress is in large part what is contributing to their patients' ailments and emotional status and condition, right? It's not being able to pay your bills. So by all means, there are things that, we could, if we're not at a place where we have a set template and we can then duplicate it in multiple realms of care. What I'm suggesting here is that we need to be conversant with those realms of wisdom that have been approaching ailments, have been approaching pain and trauma for decades and have been effective. And they're using modes that fall outside of what we would consider Western scientific objective approach. And so just simply by listening and giving value to what they're saying and the success that they're having is, I think, an important move. It's privileging the minoritized knowledge.
I also have another comment from Joe and Selena. Music can be a powerful healing experience, even through a telephone connection. Selena just finished a call that included singing together, his sharing a song. Then Selena asked if he knew a song that she had learned, and he broke into laughter and said, "How do you know this song? It really speaks to me." Music can touch and transcend barriers. And I have another comment from Don. How would I be able to be of assistance? I'm so far removed from the situation.
Yeah, I'm not too clear on the situation that is being referred to in that comment, but perhaps I could just generalize in terms of where the borderlands is for those who may not be in a border state. One of the things that you find with the current criminalizing system that we have, where where the investments lies in their incarceration, right? That's where we see the majority of the investments. And those detention centers are everywhere. They're not just in the U.S. Southwest. They target small rural areas across the United States. And so I think making yourself, getting involved with the local activists in your community and trying to find ways to raise the awareness, because these are hidden facilities. And this is the primary mode of care. But the reality is that we know from studies that these detention centers do far more harm than help for those who are detained, because of the penal logic, is the regimented schedule that they have, the surveillance. It models prison life. And when you live in those conditions day after day, they take a toll on your emotional state. And so this is not there's no reformation of this system. It simply needs to be abolished. And what curandero praxis offers us is how we can situate detainees in communities. Why can't we not offer our homes, our communities, our churches as the place for them to wait out their time while they are adjudicating their asylum case or their immigration case? Why not allow the communities, the faith communities, those activist communities, the opportunity to provide care and provision and healing and connection for detainees? And so that's one way you could certainly get involved, is to locate the nearest detention centers. There's one near you. I'm sure it's probably within I'd say 5 hour drive from where you're at. And I don't know where you're at, but that's when seeing the map, they're pretty much sprinkled out throughout the U.S.
I have another comment from the Shalom Mennonite Fellowship. I appreciate your presentation very much. Realizing the connection with training many of us in the Casa Mariposa Detention Visitation Program have been doing, mind, body, spirit. Trauma healing practices we can do for ourselves in a popular education model. And he's sharing information, www.capacitar.org, and share with migrants who have experienced trauma, also, which is all of them.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for that. And you know, one of the things that, again, why I'm proposing a completely different approach to how we care for immigrants and asylum seekers who are in this transitional place because of the law and the time that they're needing to wait in order to be heard. You find that the state has the obligation to ensure that these facilities have chapels. So this is part of the freedom of religion that is ensured for detainees. That is a one of the rights that they do have, is the freedom to practice their own faith. But unfortunately, what you find in a lot of these centers is that their understanding of what is privileged is often the religion that in the broader public supports the perpetuation of immigration detention. So what I've been able to see is there a direct link between white American evangelicalism and these and the proliferation of these institutions, right? And so that they are recruiting chaplains who are from these traditions that would not be inclined theologically to question the carceral logic that's operating in those institutions, but in many ways ensure that they continue to mitigate, its symbolic meaning and emphasize the need for repentance, right? So I've discovered that the need for detainees to repent, they're criminals. So when you start from that point of departure, you're a criminal. You're not on. That's not a good place to start with when you're talking about trying to get to a place of healing, especially when you're dealing with children and you're dealing with asylum seekers. And so, yeah, the surveillance and the difficulty of access that just us as citizens, U.S. citizens, have to those institutions just speaks to the clandestine operations that are operating and that are at play within those institutions to ensure a certain kind of reality. And that's happening from the security level, at the security level, administrative level, that's happening at the healthcare level, and it's happening at the religious care level. All of those work in concert to ensure that the institution continues to operate. And curanderismo, or curandera practice, would go in there and immediately say, right, the space is what's contributing to the pain and the trauma. And so the first thing you would need to do is remove them from that space.
We have a comment from Carrie, and she says, we have a center in Denver that receives migrants when they're released from detention. It's called Casa de Esperanza, and that is one way we have helped locally.
Mhm. Yeah, that's fantastic. You can um, certainly be there at the release stage, and I know that there are a number of ministries that are waiting with welcoming hands at bus stations, near detention centers here near in San Antonio, near Carnes and in Dilley. The bus station is a place where those released detainees are received with welcoming hands, and then there's connection and relationship that one can build with the families. But it's the enormous amount of surveillance and the how detention centers, they are intrinsically focused on profit margins, so that everything has to move in that direction. And for any system of care to jeopardize that will be seen with suspicion and quickly removed. I've seen it, and in my own research, not only in the U.S. but also in the U.K. When you have a religious care system that runs counter to the operating ethos of the detention center, it will not have much time of existence in that institution. So that there's when you have them released, that is another place, a point where you can, I think, genuinely offer a curandera praxis for those families who are released. My hope is that we can have a system that sees asylum seekers, sees migrant border crossers, not as criminals, but as humans, right? And that they are worthy of healing. They're worthy of care. Many of these populations have also been abused by a ravaging economic system that in many ways we have contributed to as a nation. And there is an obligation in many ways that we have, if we're benefiting from the economy that ravages their natural resources, rather than annihilate them, why not change our tune and offer them from the outset care, touch, right? A caress, that they are mutually involved, that this is not sit down, be quiet, I'm going to give you the care you need because I know better. No, it's how can we be in relationship? How can we be in conversation with one another? I may have resources, but you have some knowledge, and let this be a mutual engagement with care and healing.
Are there any other questions? Did anyone raise their hand? I'm not able to see the hands raised.
No, we don't have anyone raising their hand at this point.
Okay, thanks, Allison. And so they're sharing in the chat the website that they can find out about the locations of the detention centers across the country.
Mm-hmm.
freedomforimmigrants.org and Detention Watch Network,
Mm-hmm.
which we have a membership for at Fuentes and Cristo, so we have that information as well.
If there are no other questions, I don't see any either. Thank you, Dr. Cuéllar, for your time, for your passion, for your experience, your expertise. Glad we've had such good dialogue, and I know we'll be seeing you again shortly in the next session as well with your wife. And so thank you for this first offering.